Well, thank you so much, Senator Mitchell, for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you again in the near future. Hello and welcome to another episode of SacTown Talks. Today we have a special guest, Assemblymember Todd Gloria from the 78th District joining us today. Todd, welcome to the program and thank you for joining us. How's it going?
Thank you for having me. Not too bad. I'm in San Diego. I'm a happy guy.
Yeah, it's never too bad when you can escape the 100-degree heat of Sacramento and go back home. Todd, speaking of that, kind of, we're all hunkered down in our homes right now. Kind of how was sheltering in place for you? And kind of managing your district from kind of staying home. Can you kind of talk to us about that?
Sure. I love group therapy. It's a challenge, right? I think for myself and a lot of my colleagues who are kind of extroverted by nature, it's difficult to be on a stay-at-home order and doing the work that we do largely solitary or through electronic means. I share with folks, this is a business that's often described as, shaking hands and kissing babies, and you can't do either of those things right now. And that's made more difficult by the fact that a lot of folks are looking to us for information, for comfort, for connection. And it's just made more difficult by this. So I struggle with the need to follow the public health order, which I am doing, with the desire to be responsive and connect my constituents and to make sure that we're addressing the very real challenges that they're having. My office is inundated with calls from constituents, largely around unemployment insurance, and trying to be effective for them while staying at home is a challenge. We're doing the best that we can.
Yeah, it's been an interesting time. We keep hearing, every member talk about the unemployment insurance, I guess the struggle that's been. But I guess, how was it, managing your staff remotely and kind of, working other issues outside of unemployment, kind of, communicating with your constituents?
Yeah, well, managing the staff's been pretty good. I mean, I got a team of pros that I'm super proud of, and all of them are stepping up. And for the Sacramento listening audience, I think they all know how our offices are normally arranged. I'll tell you that every member of my team is now an unemployment caseworker. And just to kind of give you a sense of the change that we've made here. So everyone from my chief of staff to my communications director to everyone else, everyone has some piece of that load because the load is so enormous. But in terms of what we're doing, I have been able to get out of the house. Grateful that I'm a designated essential worker and have done everything from food drives, masks and face covering deliveries to helping distribute laptops for distance learning for our school district. We've been out about, and that's been a way of me hopefully getting an understanding of what Californians are dealing with, what San Diegans are dealing with, and then be able to reflect that in the work that we're doing and the votes that we're taking in Sacramento.
Yeah, right before, the shelter-in-place order, you were coming off a big primary win for the mayoral race. What's the latest with your campaign, and has it been kind of suspended, or have you been able to, carry that momentum forward?
It's definitely different. We won the primary election with really good results, and then about a week later, this pandemic becomes more front and center, and the stay-at-home order came along shortly thereafter. It's a real challenge. There was no how to campaign in a pandemic when I was studying poli-sci at the University of San Diego. And frankly, we're having to make up the rule book for this. And a lot of it is exactly this, is virtual meetings and virtual fundraising. It's taking a different tact, and we're just trying to figure out where people's comfort levels are. Recognizing that politics and campaigning is not the top of their priority list right now. The top of it is keeping themselves and their families safe. Dealing with job loss or economic impacts of the pandemic. We are somewhere further down the priority list, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, we still have an election coming in November. There's a chance to break status quo and bring transformational change to the second largest city in the state, and I'm still working hard to be the person that brings that change.
Yeah, I think you're, running for maybe one of the greatest jobs in the world, being the mayor of San Diego. San Diego politically is a very interesting place. Traditionally has been kind of conservative. And it seems like you're kind of breaking a mold and coming in with this more progressive agenda. Can you kind of talk about how, running this progressive campaign has been adopted by the city and about the changing politics of San Diego?
Well, we are changing as a community. I think in the Sacramento community, when folks think of San Diego, I would understand if they largely thought about Pete Wilson. But Pete has not been mayor of San Diego in many decades, and he's been out of office for some time too. And San Diego has changed significantly, not just in party registration, but in racial demographics. We've become more urban, and as we've grown to be the 8th largest city in the United States. So there's a lot of change that's here, and it's reflected in the politics of our community and in the priorities of our community. When I served on the city council, pushing things like a climate action plan that was legally enforceable with a 100% renewable energy target, that was pretty aggressive. That was only 6 years ago. But I point out to people that particular plan, which was kind of the first of its kind in the nation, was adopted on a unanimous bipartisan vote of the city council. So I think that's probably one of the best examples of the evolving political nature of our city. And I think our strong showing in the primary was also an indication of that. And you may know that historically there has been a divide in our city of the communities north of the 8 and those south of the 8, and south being more racially diverse and more progressive, and the north being less racially diverse and perhaps less progressive. I'm proud to say that I won most of the precincts on both sides of that divide. And it gives me hope that not only will I be successful in this election, but this agenda of making sure that we are a big city that acts like it, that we embrace our size and our scale, and act accordingly, is not only going to resonate on election day, but allow me to pursue an agenda that is fundamentally at its core about making sure that working and middle class people can afford to live in this city. Increasingly, that's at risk. And I don't think we can be a great city if we're just a city for the very wealthy who can afford to live here and the very poor who are trapped here.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing you bring up is the poor in San Diego. Kind of your, I guess, experience as a housing commissioner before, working up here at the legislature. Housing has been a big issue. Basically, the COVID crisis has exposed this of people who have houses and people who do not. The last time I was in San Diego, you see downtown, lots of tents and things like that. Have any of these, I guess, temporary motel programs helped the homelessness situation? And kind of, I guess, how's the housing and homeless crisis going in San Diego right now?
I'm so grateful you raised it, because prior to the pandemic, this was undoubtedly the number one issue for San Diegans, and I think probably for Californians. And you saw that in Governor Newsom's State of the State address, exclusively devoted to the issue of homelessness and housing affordability. But I think there's been a temptation by some to suggest that, in the midst of this pandemic, again, there are other priorities that are capturing attention. My observation is we had a homelessness crisis before the pandemic. There is one right now, and there may be even a bigger one afterward if we don't work well during this crisis. So you're right. San Diego, I'm proud, has, I think, stepped up. You may know, we took our San Diego Convention Center and repurposed it into a temporary homeless facility. Okay. Over 1,200 unsheltered San Diegans are staying there currently, and hundreds more are staying in hotel rooms across our community. And as a consequence, we've seen a relatively low prevalence of COVID-19 amongst the unsheltered. And I think that's a success. The challenge, of course, is at some point we will have defeated coronavirus. And we can't simply just invite the 1,200 people at the convention center to go out on Harbor Drive and wish them well. We have to have a plan for how to transition those folks. And the state budget that we have come to agreement on, I think will make a significant commitment from the state to try and acquire motels to repurpose them for permanent supportive housing. And that will be a way to make sure that folks aren't just excused from the convention center and put back onto the streets. It's going to take a lot more than that. And there is likely to be an effort on this November's ballot down in San Diego of a very large bond offering to finance additional housing construction for our homeless. So I have tremendous hope going forward that we can become one of the communities across the nation that has successfully ended chronic homelessness. We are not that currently. I think in our recent history, probably most evident by the 2017 hepatitis A outbreak we had in San Diego that killed 20 people and infected 500 more, largely homeless people. That was our recent history. I think we can do far better than that. That's part of why I'm running for mayor. Is my career has been almost entirely focused on housing and homelessness issue. And if this is the number one issue for San Diegans, maybe it's time to put a homelessness advocate in the mayor's office.
Yeah, it sounds like you're the right man for at the right time coming in. You touched upon the budget. As we just know, uh, the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor just came to a budget deal. Can you kind of talk to us about the budget and kind of what's in there for San Diego and things that you were championing for?
Yeah, I mean, this is not the budget we were hoping to adopt. Now, was it?
Right.
You go from a $9 billion surplus to a $54 billion deficit. There's definitely a lot of whiplash when it comes to this issue. But I think that our speaker, our pro tem, who is proudly from San Diego, and our governor, who has distinguished himself by coming down to San Diego with such frequency. We're not accustomed to seeing the governor in San Diego as often as we do, and as we do with this governor. And as a consequence, I think this budget is about as good as it could be for San Diego. I think the first and most obvious benefit of this budget is the light touch it takes to public education. When I talk to San Diegans as they deal with this virus, they would like to go back to work, but they know that that's going to be impossible or next to impossible without the schools reopening.
Right.
And the kinds of cuts that were initially envisioned to public education would have made it impossible. My school board members were very clear with me that there's no way they could safely reopen with the kinds of reductions that were envisioned. And this budget largely avoids that. And that's a good thing. I think the second order priority for me was around healthcare. And the cuts that were initially envisioned, I think were not good generally, but would have been particularly difficult in the context of a pandemic, when people are having a public health emergency. And so those were avoided. And then, the third issue for me is always housing and homelessness. And this budget actually has some enhancements for those issues, not as much as we had once hoped. I supported Miguel Santiago's $2 billion commitment to homelessness. And obviously that's not in this budget, but there continues to be a relatively healthy commitment from the state to homelessness. And that money will undoubtedly make its way to San Diego. And in fact, some of the previous money that we've committed in past state budgets is exactly how the convention center was able to be quickly repurposed into a homeless shelter. So in a year where it could have been all bad news, I think there's some decent news that's there. And our collective focus now must be on making sure that the federal government does what it needs to do, which is pass additional relief aimed at helping state and local governments. This is not just about California. This is really every state, every city, every school district that needs additional relief. And, when you listen to the comments of our Treasury Secretary, our Federal Reserve Chairman, they all indicate they know that this is necessary. So the question becomes, what are we waiting for? Let's take action and make sure that we don't have to lay off a bunch of firefighters, nurses, and other folks. We can make sure that they stay focused on what we need to do, which is to contain COVID-19, tackle the economic crisis, and get Californians back to work.
Kind of as you alluded to, at the beginning of the year, there was a lot of optimism. Once again, we had record surpluses, and we were just coming off the bill deadline where a lot of members had maybe 30 plus bills. Can you talk about your legislative package and how it's changed in light of COVID and kind of what you're planning here, I guess, in the next few months?
Well, it definitely went on a diet. I don't know that all of us on home, stay at home have gone on a diet, but my bill package definitely has. We had to make some tough decisions. And, what we focused on is what I think either bills that I've been working on for some time now to bills that I think are directly relevant to the crisis to pieces of that I think could be helpful for recovery. So maybe three quick examples. During my time in the legislature, acknowledging that focus and commitment to homelessness, mental health is a serious component of our homelessness crisis. Many folks are familiar with the state audit that showed that our Mental Health Services Act money is largely being hoarded by counties and not being spent on mental health needs.
Right.
I think that's absolutely unacceptable given the size of our homelessness crisis, recognizing many of our homeless suffer from mental illness. And so third time's hopefully a charm for the legislation I'm offering that would really push those dollars to our homeless. That has gotten off the Assembly floor, and I'm excited about that. But that was a bill that we preserved. There were other bills that we had addressing other needs. I'm thinking specifically of some legislation around LGBT students that was very difficult to take a step back from, but recognizing that legislation came with a fairly significant dollar amount measured in several $million. That was difficult to pursue when we are simply trying to keep the doors of our schools open. So the governor has made a commitment that we will get back to that. I won't be able to do that as a member of the legislature, but I'm hopeful to be able to champion that as a mayor of its second largest city of this state. But kind of speaks to the really difficult choices, the sort of Sophie's choice, if you will, of what you maintain and what you have to step away from. And I'm proud of the bill package we are working on. I think that, again, there are some things that are relevant to the virus and to the recovery that we'll be able to help going forward.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring up about your AB 2576 dealing with mental health. The Innovation Fund has billions of dollars in it, and counties, aren't able to spend that money. And I guess freeing up that money, could help a lot of these issues you've brought up. And I think kind of one interesting thing that's come up, I guess, in the last few weeks with the George Floyd protests and such, is this kind of rethinking policing. And I know Shirley Weber, one of your co-assembly members from San Diego, has been big on this issue. But kind of, I guess, what are your thoughts on, I guess, reshaping how policing is occurring, and kind of how kind of this reshape, policing can deal with mental health issues better?
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of the areas of consensus. As someone who has had a strong voting record when it comes to police reform and accountability, I've also enjoyed strong relationships with law enforcement. And what I observe is that on both sides of that debate are in agreement with the fact that it is often not the most appropriate response to send a uniformed law enforcement officer with a gun to deal with a mentally ill person. Now, in some cases, it may be necessary, particularly if they're acting out violently. But right now, that is our chosen response, simply because that's our only means of responding. If a San Diegan saw someone having a mental health crisis in front of their business or in front of their home, their only option is to call 911. That dispatcher's only option is to send a squad car. And as a consequence, we take a situation that's difficult on any given day and may make it worse by inserting a gun into the situation. And so by taking these state dollars, these Mental Health Services Act dollars that go to the county, and really either incentivizing or using more of a stick approach to make sure these dollars are spent, I can see a situation where those dollars are spent to provide additional training to law enforcement to make sure that when they have these situations, they can handle it from a more of a guardian perspective rather than a warrior one, or to ramp up the number of psychologists, social workers, and others who can respond to these calls 24/7, 365. And I think that's, again, one of our challenges is that we don't currently have that capability. I'm hopeful that this conversation, which is admittedly a very difficult and complex conversation, it's not going to get done in a couple of days or a couple of weeks. It's going to have to take concerted and long-term commitment that we can do that and come out of the back end of this with something that everyone can feel good about. Because, again, in terms of my conversations, I don't know that anyone on either side of this coin are happy with the current status quo. And that's a good thing. That means that I think we can achieve some sort of level of progress that California can feel good about. And frankly, when California comes to some sort of conclusion, often the nation follows. And I hope that would be the case in this situation.
Kind of just, I guess, to follow up back on kind of housing, now that, you're potentially going back to be a mayor of San Diego, you started out as a council member, you've come to Sacramento, you've heard, I guess, some of these statewide issues. Now you're going back to the city. Kind of, I guess, what have you learned and what can you apply to kind of, I guess, address the housing issue specifically in San Diego?
Well, I love that question because I will confess to, prior to my election to the assembly, I think when you're a local elected official, you think the state's the devil, right? It just simply lives to make your life difficult. And, obviously I've learned better. And I think that I will be a better mayor for having had this experience of not just better understanding of how the legislature and the state government works, but certainly the relationships with folks like our governor, our attorney general, our legislative leaders, and my colleagues now who I expect to continue to call and ask for their help for my city if given the opportunity. But on the issue of housing, local control, of course, is important. And I'm a believer in local control, but I come from a city that has taken a relatively pro-development background. We have a mayor who openly embraces the concept of being a YIMBY, or yes in my backyard. As a consequence, there have been some relatively aggressive reforms and ordinances adopted to increase housing production. It's not enough. We have to do more work before I think working in middle class San Diegans can feel like they got a shot in this town to make the rent, maybe buy a home and build some wealth. But we have certainly made some progress. I don't think that's true across the state. And when I look at a lot of other cities, I see a lot of foot dragging. I see a lot of excuses. And I don't believe that my hometown of San Diego can solve the entirety of the state's housing crisis by itself. And so as a consequence, I do think that there is a role for the state to pass pieces of legislation like Senate Bill 330 that was passed in the last session to ask cities to step up. To do their fair share of housing production. When I think about certain cities that are glad to have international corporations build new world headquarters in their city, but then are reluctant to ever build the housing that actually would allow the workers who work for that company to live in the same town where they work in, well, that's just wrong. And if they can't solve the problem on a local level, there should be some intervention at the state level to help facilitate that. It is required, it is necessary, and I'm hopeful. I leave the legislature understanding that process a bit better now.
Earlier, you were talking about, I guess, federal stimulus coming to cities, counties, the state to help address these budget shortfalls. How are the finances of the city of San Diego looking? And, are they going to be able to weather this kind of coronavirus downturn? And are they rebounding I guess adequately, given that things are opening up now?
Well, time will tell. But right now the outlook could be a lot better. What I mean by that is that the city actually was forecasting a budget deficit before the pandemic hit. And it was roughly $70 million deficit projected when the mayor introduced his budget at the beginning of the year. That has ballooned to over $300 million now because of COVID and the resulting recession. And the reason the city is not making draconian cuts is because the Federal CARES Act sent them about $250 million. So when you're looking at a $300 million deficit, you can stitch that together. Going forward, I think most people would expect us to be in a recovery process for the next number of years. And that will hurt. That certainly will hurt the city. And so I'm hopeful to win this election to be the next mayor of San Diego, sober to the fact that it's going to be coming in to a time when we're dealing with a significant budget crisis. Now, I'm not excited about that opportunity, but I'm also not afraid of it, because when I was elected to the city council in 2008, that was obviously at the height of the Great Recession. We were facing a 9-figure budget deficit back then as well. And with good financial discipline, we were able to turn those major deficits into surpluses by the time I left the city council. We left a pretty healthy reserve at City Hall, reserve that they're now utilizing to help balance the city's budget. So seeing difficult times before, I know we can get through it. And I think that experience will be helpful going forward to make sure the cities can rebound. At the end of the day, San Diego is always a good investment. We are blessed and fortunate to have a strong military and defense spending that is always sort of a foundation of our economy. We have a thriving innovation economy with life sciences, biotech, high tech, manufacturing. We have the international border, which provides unique opportunities both with Baja and with the Pacific Rim. The concern I have is really in our hospitality industry. At the end of the day, we're a proud tourist town. We love welcoming out-of-towners to San Diego, and that's a part of our economy that's probably going to take longer to recover. And so I'm currently working to develop a back-to-work blueprint for San Diego so that we can explain to people what I would hope to do as mayor to get the city's entire economy back on its feet, but particularly focused on our hospitality industry, which, of course, will be bearing the brunt of this for some time.
Yeah, that's, I guess, something I wanted to touch on is, we've opened up into the kind of this quasi 2.75 or maybe stage 3, depending on how you're looking at it. Things are reopening, but testing, is going up, cases are going up. And it seems like San Diego is kind of taking more of a measured approach, or trying to take a more measured approach to reopening. And kind of, as you touched upon, San Diego is such a tourist town. I mean, the airport, the Southwest terminal is always so packed up there. And, just seeing pictures
it's a petri dish
up there as it empty is just kind of shocking to me. So I guess, can you kind of tell us about, I guess, how reopening is going, and I guess, the concerns about the cases rising, and I guess are the cases in San Diego kind of rising as much as some of these other parts in the state?
They are, and it's concerning. This past Sunday and Monday, we saw over 300 new cases in our community. We've been much closer to about 100 a day. So that was alarming. Yesterday's number was closer to our trend line, but it's still higher. And we are acutely aware of the fact that, in just across the border, that there continues to be a significant outbreak there. And then our adjoining county of Imperial County also has an outbreak. So we're in the throes of it, and we have great medical professionals. I think by and large, everyone's doing about the best that they can. But what I've been frustrated by is that what we see, like across the state, is some reticence to follow the face mask order. We have had actually a face covering order here on the county level since May the 1st. So what the governor did last week is not new to San Diego, but its adherence, people's use of it is a little spotty. Social distancing continues to be a challenge in the Gaslamp Quarter, which may be a part of our city you're familiar with. Right. As people have reopened, what I've observed are businesses that are following the guidelines, that are maintaining lower occupancies, that are using personal protective equipment for employees. But it isn't necessarily matched by the customer. And I've been outspoken in thinking that the city could do a better job of being helpful. I recommended, and is now in place, a closure of Fifth Avenue to vehicle traffic in order to allow businesses that are metering the number of customers entering restaurants and bars to be able to social distance on the sidewalk. Narrow sidewalks, lots of people, it's a recipe for community spread. Allowing people to be able to spread out in social distance, maybe even have a couple of tables outside. I think that's one of the ways that we can hit that balance of reopening the economy, allowing businesses to be successful, put San Diegans back to work, while hopefully limiting the kind of community spread that would undoubtedly trigger a closure of our economy again. So we have still some work to do. And again, I'm focused on these recent numbers, which if they continue on their current path would be very troubling, as well as our continued need to be better partners and helpers to our neighbors in Baja, as well as our neighbors in Imperial County.
One thing, if anyone out there, follow Todd on Instagram, he posts, great things. And one of my favorite things that you post, Todd, are pictures of your dad, especially from in the past. Your dad has some of the best kind of hair, great 80s hair. I'm wondering, a lot of us haven't got haircuts in a while, but you're looking pretty well groomed and kind of, why aren't you following your dad's lead more on hairstyle?
Well, this is where we're going to disagree, because I think he has the worst hair.
Oh,
that photo I posted for his for Father's Day was from the 1970s, where he had sort of a Kiss kind of hair, right? He looked like a band member. But to even to this day, his hair is still a little longer. In fact, when people will come up to me and say, "I work with your dad. He's the guy with the hair." I mean, that's the level that we're dealing with on how he is understood or known in our city. We actually can, have haircuts in San Diego. And so I will tell you that here's what I learned. The benefit of shopping local and long-term relationships, the guy who cuts my hair has been cutting my hair for nearly 20 years. Needless to say, when they reopened, I was first in line. And that's the kind of the benefits of being a loyal customer for a long period of time. But prior to that, I will tell you, this was 90% product and 10% hair, because it was just pasting it all into place. I looked pretty shaggy when those first couple of days that the legislature reconvened, because just was not camera ready.
Oh, too funny. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Todd. Is there anything else you want to get out there before we go?
I just will say that I appreciate this opportunity. I'm grateful to be part of a capital community that I think everyone can be proud of what California is doing. We have done a good job. We have to maintain that. And I recognize that's a part of a community that's working together. And I'm, again, glad to be a small part of it.
Well, thank you for joining us, and best of luck in the mayor's race, and hope to have you on later again this year.
I hope so.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to another episode of SacTown Talks. Today we have a special guest, Assemblywoman Jacqui Irwin, coming from the 44th Assembly District. As you can see there in her background, Jacqui, how you doing? Welcome to the program.
Hey, I'm doing great, and thank you for the invitation.
There's been, a lot going on lately here, as we've seen. Something new is happening every week. But, a lot of us has been sheltered in place for a while, as you are as well. in early March, we've all been part of these stay-at-home orders. Can you kind of describe, I guess, how the stay-at-home orders, I guess, have shaped your work in the 44th Assembly District?
Well, certainly. Yeah, this is, everybody keeps saying unprecedented, and certainly we have had to shift a lot to get used to this new paradigm of working at home. So we were sent home suddenly, and we made decision very early on that my staff, the entire staff, was going to meet every single morning. So Monday through Friday, we are all together. And the most important thing was making sure that we help the constituents in the 44th district. So the Capitol staff, they were supposed to, everything was about supporting what the district staff was doing. So they were doing a lot of research on issues that we had constituents asking about, especially EDD. I mean, I think that they have PTSD from all the EDD questions that they've had to answer, and the very tragic stories. Some people haven't even gotten their first check yet, but they have been on the phone constantly doing outstanding work and completely supported by our Capitol staff. But we also, there was a big lack of information. Everybody was clamoring for answers. So we had 10 teletown halls in English. We had 8 in Spanish. We had a few Zoom calls on Facebook with some famous doctors to answer questions. We collected PPE because that was a huge issue at the beginning, as I'm sure you remember.
Right.
And there was a critical shortage of blood, so we hosted or helped host about 6 blood drives. And it was really great to see people that were stepping up so quickly. As soon as we would put in post something on social media, we would immediately fill the blood drive. Everybody wanted to do whatever they could. And then the big thing that I've been working on is a big collaborative effort to do antibody testing in Ventura County over sampling in vulnerable populations to see how long antibodies last and what the effect is in groups like ag workers and seniors and the homeless. So we've been really busy, and then of course not really staying at home because I've been flying up to Sacramento for I guess it's the last 5 weeks or so, and doing all my Zoom meetings from my apartment in Sacramento. So yeah, crazy times.
One interesting thing, I guess, about, public service and the assembly in general is everyone has such a different background. And I think you probably have one of the more interesting backgrounds. Can you kind of, I guess, talk about your background, I guess, in engineering and kind of, I guess, how it's helped shape your view on, COVID and looking into different solutions?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. We do have a few engineers in the assembly, and we're obviously shaped by a lot of things. My parents are actually immigrants, and so I do have a lot in common with many of my fellow legislators. They came from Holland, and I moved back to California when I was 6, I think. And I was the first one to go to college, and then graduated from UC San Diego with an engineering degree, and then worked at Teledyne Systems and the Applied Physics Lab. And I think that, I think it's good to have some of that sort of scientific background when you're looking at bills. There's always this, the what is the best ideology and how we want to help people. But I think that people that come from more scientific backgrounds are also looking at a lot of what are the unintended consequences, and are we really helping the people we want to help? And sometimes things that seem very good on the surface, as we analyze them, my staff knows that we go over every single bill and talk about the pros and cons and unintended consequences. But are we really accomplishing what we want to through with the bills that are being proposed? So I think it brings a good perspective to have at least a few of us sprinkled in there. And, I would like to see more people with scientific backgrounds also. we all bring a different perspective, and I think that that's what makes the legislature so rich here in California.
Earlier, you kind of mentioned your interest in antibody testing. With a flood of information out there, not knowing what's right and what's wrong. I guess, can you give us an update or kind of findings of this antibody testing in your area?
And so I think there's still a lot unknown, and there have been a lot of questions about the accuracy of antibody testing, because a lot of the none of them, I think right now, none of them have FDA approval. About 10 tests have emergency authorization, and we are using 2 of the tests that have emergency authorization. And there were a lot of tests that came out initially because I think people understood what the importance is of knowing whether you have antibodies or not. Because if this disease is like any other disease, antibodies will help protect you from getting COVID for a second time. But it isn't really that clear what the antibodies do in this case. So I think it's really important to first use accurate antibody tests, and second, make sure you control for things, and then start to do longitudinal studies to see how long antibodies actually last. So what we have here in Ventura County, we're using a blood draw test, which is, we think that is more accurate. But if you end up right now with very low seroprevalence rates, so that means a very small portion of the population actually has the antibodies, there is a fairly high false positive rate. So we're taking everybody that we test, and if they have a positive test, we're testing them a second time with a different test. And then we will ask those people to be followed. We'll test their antibodies every month or so. And that's something that the CDC recommended a few weeks ago because of this uncertainty about how these tests operate. But we're trying to see what are the communities that are more affected. And we're seeing anecdotally already that some of our lower socioeconomic communities have higher rates of antibodies than the population in general. And that really should inform policy. And I was just talking to a doctor that's doing other testing himself. It would be very important to know, for instance, in the classroom, if a child gets the disease, gets COVID, are they passing it on to their parents? And I should say, if they're at home, are they passing it on to their parents? And I think this would really look at policy about whether it is really the best thing to keep kids home from school or not. A study in New York showed that they could not find a single case of COVID being passed from child to parent. And does that mean it happened or not? We don't know. But what we're looking at here in Ventura County is to add to the total pool of knowledge. And that's with these studies that are going on all over California and all over the United States. I think that's the only way we're really going to start to find answers, and try and get people back to work, or try to get kids back to school, is if we really understand the disease. The scary thought is, if you're not creating antibodies, does that mean that you potentially are not going to be able to create a vaccine? If the antibody, if your body is not maintaining antibodies, then right, is there potentially a vaccine? So maybe people that had COVID were able to fight it off in some other way, more at the cellular level. We don't know, but everybody's working to get as much information as possible. And we have like this incredible coalition that's working together, and it's the firefighters are really leading in the testing effort. Here we're working with Oxnard Fire Department, and they have already tested almost every first responder in the county, and then we're working at CLU with Matthew Finnip, who is an economist, and with 2 UCLA professors, and we're doing this as an academic study, and with the county and all different stakeholders that really want to find answers to what is really happening with COVID.
Fascinating. You mentioned that you've been coming back to Sacramento for the last 5 weeks or so. Kind of, how has it been coming back to the Capitol, and kind of, I guess, how are you able to to operate, with these new, I guess, safety precautions and kind of get your legislation through?
Well, we all have a lot less, or I should say, the vast majority of us are carrying way fewer bills than we were before, and they were only in one policy committee apiece. So I don't see that there's a lot of action in that area, but basically, I'm trying to take the first flight in the morning because I think the plane is the cleanest then. And it was it was interesting, right when we came back and right before we left, that the planes were completely empty. I flew one time with 5 people on the plane and one with about 10 people. Now there's a center seat. So, but it's still, you're uncomfortably close to other people. So you already feel that you're at much higher risk. But I think that staff has been doing a very good job in trying to make the hearings as safe as possible and doing the distancing when we're in the Capitol chambers. And for the rest of the time, I'm just in my apartment. Although I have a couple of walking groups, we all decided that it is safe to, as long as we're socially distant. And in the evening, I have one group of ladies that walk, and then we have another group that walks with McCarty, Kevin McCarty, and he takes us usually around 5 or 6 for tours of Sacramento. And the very first tour, we ended up in the cemetery, and we were looking for a relation of Alexander Hamilton. That day, it was Evan Lowe that came along too. So we did not. It's a very large cemetery, and it was really spooky. And then we thought we almost got locked in. So it was really an adventure. But that's usually our Tuesday walk. In the heat, looking at getting the tour of the different parts of Sacramento. And sometimes, there's all these different rules now with drinking. And so sometimes we'll stop for, at a bar or something along the way, or a pub where you can sit outside and, try to stay safe. But so few people have had any social interaction. And so it's really nice to be able to do something that, seems to be, evidence is showing that it's relatively safe to be outside as long as you're distant. So that's it changed things up a lot, but that's what we've been doing.
You just mentioned, I guess, your bill package took a tremendous cut. We just had Todd Gloria on, and he said, his bill package went on a diet. Maybe he didn't, but his bill package did. Can you kind of talk about, I guess, your bill package and how it's changed through the COVID crisis?
Well, there were definitely, I think it was, if you had anything that was somewhat controversial, it was really difficult especially because you're only going through one policy committee. So a lot of bills dropped off because of that. Somebody raised an objection, and there just wasn't enough time to work on the bill. But I'll talk about 3 that we think are still COVID related and that seem to be moving forward. We'll see what happens in the Senate. We never know exactly what is happening in the Senate, but we have an online charitable giving bill, and we've seen with COVID and obviously, when you have these natural disasters like we've had in our area, that a lot of people are doing online giving. And so this is really putting, making sure that the Attorney General puts a regulatory framework around there to make sure that your money is going where you want it to. We unfortunately, during the fires, we've seen people that have these Fund Me sites where the money is not going to where the donor expected that it goes. So this one is moving forward. We're working with a lot of stakeholders to try to get it right, and then the Attorney General is the sponsor of that one. But a lot of difficult, complicated discussions on that one. We also are working. So last year or the year before, I had the borderline shooting in my district, and I very tragic, affected a lot of young people, and really had our community totally traumatized. And so, of course, when something like that happens, you want to work on bills that will make a difference. And one of the things that we think has a lot of potential and isn't fully being utilized is our GVROs. So I had a couple of GVRO bills last year, and this year I have one that allows district attorneys to assist with gun violence restraining orders. Still in San Diego, they are utilizing them a lot, but throughout the rest of the state, they're not really being utilized. And basically, gun violence restraining orders temporarily take guns away from people that shouldn't have them. And in the case in Thousand Oaks, we don't know if it would have made a difference, but certainly people understood that this was a very troubled young man, and if somebody would have, there is a potential that a GVRO would have helped. So we're working on that. I'm working with the district attorney in Ventura County, and it has the support of all the district attorneys, just to have some, an additional helping hand to get the GVROs through. And then we have a telehealth bill. So we were working on a more all-encompassing 5150 bill. I went for a tour right before the COVID out crisis and was in an ER, and we were talking about how often people that are going through mental breakdowns are stuck in the ER for a long period of time because they can't get a mental health professional to issue a declaration that they're 5150 and then get the right type of care for them. That bill we pulled back, and we'll work on it again next year, but we turned it into something that was more pressing, which is being able to declare 5150s via telehealth. And, it's really the same type of idea that you have somebody in a emergency room and you really need to get them out as soon as possible and into the type of mental health services that are appropriate for them. So hopefully that one moves through. It was on consent partway, and then we have a few people that are concerned that it would be used too much. But we have, I think there's about 6 or 7 counties that are already using it, and it's been very successful and opt-in. So hopefully that one moves through too. And then in response to the social uprisings that we have had after the shooting, I am doing I'm working on a bill with Autumn after. Not the shooting. After the protests, all the protests that we've seen. I'm working on a bill with Autumn Burke on police reform, and we're not exactly, we haven't exactly teased out all the details on that, but it's really looking at early on in the hiring process, what can you do to make sure that you're attracting the right people into the profession. Obviously, we have a big we have an issue in the United States, and there has to be some sort of reconciliation. And so this is looking at pre-employment and potentially looking at the Psych exam. From what we understand, the Psych exam for pre-employment has not changed significantly in many years, and it's still not dealing with trying to find out, implicit and explicit bias in the applicant. So we're sort of working in that arena to see where we might go, and really happy to be working with Autumn on that.
Yeah, that's, I guess, a really interesting topic you just brought up about kind of backgrounding police. I remember, what was it, 1992 LA riots, the Rodney King beating. Coming out of the Simi Valley area where it was understood, I guess, that a lot of LAPD members live. And I guess, can you kind of talk about how, I guess, the mentality around policing in your district has, I guess, changed over the last 20 years?
Yeah. And Simi, I don't represent Simi Valley, but it's right next door. It's Ventura County, and And it is, my daughter was born a week after the riots. And so it was so depressing to see that video of excessive force, to see somebody's life being snuffed out like that. And the anger that came with that, and really the depression that we haven't moved further along in nationwide in dealing with racism and institutional racism. In our area, so I do a lot of work with the Ventura County Sheriff's Department and some of the different PDs here. The Sheriff's Department covers a lot of the cities. It's actually quite a progressive Sheriff's Department. They do a lot of what you call community-oriented policing. If you look in Oxnard, they work on building drag racers. This is Oxnard PD with community, with the kids in the community. In this area, we have something called safe passages, where the police work with kids from a low-income area, and there's a homework club, and there's field trips, and there's STEM workshops, and during COVID, actually, they're bringing food in and making sure that all the families have groceries. And this really allows the kids to know a lot of the deputies and really have a positive view of law enforcement. This county has also been implementing a lot of reform. So they have the vast majority of public safety in the county has done crisis intervention training, and I've been through with them on a number of ride-alongs. I try to do that every year or so, and it's really something to see that in how that works. The reality of it, where they start talking slower and trying to de-escalate the situation. So last year when Shirley Weber was working on her on 392, I had told her that this is really a program that needs to be looked in and funded for other departments that aren't doing it, because it really trains the police officers to try to de-escalate before something happens. And it's been, we see in this community a very positive view of the Sheriff's Department, a real positive view of law enforcement. Unfortunately, we had a really lousy incident last weekend, but so it's different than a lot of communities, because they've been very proactive in the way that they're working with the public and the youth.
I guess that's kind of one thing you just brought up, about, I guess, funding. And a lot of you and your members have been discussing the budget lately. The governor, the Assembly, and the Senate just came to a budget agreement. Can you kind of, I guess, touch upon the budget and kind of, how it looks for your district?
Well, I think that this year was really different, because you had the two houses really coming together and wanting to make sure to avoid cuts as much as possible. And so it was, I think it probably put us in the best negotiating position with the governor, because usually it's a three-way conversation. Looking at the budget, I think it's I think it looks like we have really tried to spare the most important items. There's a lot to be unhappy about, but given what the crisis is, I think what was done with especially K-12 education is really positive. Trying to hold on to positions, making sure that at least over the next year that you're not losing teachers and adding to the unemployment issue. Community colleges fared pretty well. Big cuts though to UC and Cal State, which is very unfortunate. But I think we're going to see what it looks like next year and the year after. I think the one of the things that I'm working with a group of this group of Senate, we have a bicameral group working on economic recovery and economic stimulation. I think it's really important to try to get as much information as possible and talk to economists about what is it that the state can do to really get the economy in gear as quickly as possible. And that's making sure that that small businesses are able to survive and get started again, and making sure that there's capital to keep people in their homes and not on the streets, because they have, otherwise you're exacerbating the homeless crisis. So we're going to have to do a lot as a state to recover from this, but part of it is going to have to be like stimulus spending to keep things going, especially once the federal government stops the cash flow.
I guess as an assemblywoman, is one of your jobs, but you're also a mom, and I guess a lot of us parents are kind of wondering, what's school going to look like in this coming school year? Is it going to happen? Is there going to be more distance learning? I guess, is there anything that you can share with us on kind of your thoughts about the upcoming school year and then what's it going to look like?
Well, I think parents have had it parents of young children have really have had it extremely difficult in the last few months, especially trying to do the learning at home. My kids they all happen to be in a situation where they've graduated from college already, and they're going to graduate school, and they're able to study at home. So they have not been affected. What I am really concerned about is, not only the kids, what is it going to look like in September, but how much have we exacerbated the income inequality in the schools that are in areas that are more challenged in my district? They didn't have, good internet conductivity. They didn't have schools. So a lot of the kids didn't even have classes for the last few months. And so I think there's, that is something that we're really going to have to focus on is how do we catch these kids up again? And should they be going back to school? Part of it depends on what we find out from, what are we going to learn about whether the kids are passing COVID on to their parents. There's probably going to be a second spike. We see numbers increasing throughout the state.
Right.
And we really need to know one way or another whether these kids at school are getting sick themselves or are going to get sick. We haven't really seen a lot of young children affected, but also are they passing it on to their parents? Because that was, I think, the main reason for closing down the school so quickly at the beginning of the crisis. So I think there's they're going to need funding to do distancing at school, but the reality is still that you're not going to be able to stop all interaction of kids at school.
Right.
And so really trying to learn about, doing what we can to research whether they're going to be passing it on to other family members is really very critical. And making sure that these low-income communities that don't have internet connection, we need to make sure that they get it by the fall.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I guess if you have any final and parting thoughts for us?
No, I ended every town hall with saying, be kind to each other. And I'm not sure if I have too much to add beyond that. It's, we are in very difficult times. And then when we see this additional division, about whether, COVID is real or whether we should wear masks or not, it's disconcerting. So I would just say, be kind.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and hope to have you on again sometime soon.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Some are called dreamers.